Commission. The town of Adams has contracted with our agency to do a couple of different planning projects, so we're going to talk about those tonight. Right now, what we want to focus mostly on is the town's hazard mitigation plan. The town has a plan that expired in 2012, and it needs to update that plan to be eligible for FEMA grants. And so the town has brought us on board to try to get that done. So what we want to talk about mostly tonight is natural hazards. So natural hazards are those things that Mother Nature imposes upon us. Things like flooding, things like severe storms, things like blizzards, thunderstorms, microbursts. Those are the kind of things that we need to look at to evaluate all of these different events and try to evaluate what impacts Adams the most, what causes the greatest damages. And for FEMA, when it comes to hazards and damages, we're talking about damages to people and property. That's what FEMA focuses on mostly. And so the town, we've drafted a plan that mirrors the state's hazard mitigation plan. And we looked at all of the hazards that the state evaluated. Of course, things like coastal surges and things like that, we didn't have to, we're landlocked. But we took the state hazard mitigation plan as our backbone, as our foundation. So what we want to do is look at the hazards, but then say, where do they occur? Why do they occur? What do they do for damages? Well, how do they threaten people and property? And is there anything we can do up front to minimize the impacts when the hazard happens? Flooding's the big one in Berkshire County. It's a real big one in Adams. So we say to ourselves, when it floods, why does it flood? Is it natural? Is it man-made? Is it that we have storm drain systems undersized? And then say, what can we do up front to minimize the flooding when it happens? So that's what we start to do. We document what's happened in the past. We look at what we think is going to happen in the future and say, what can we do to mitigate up front to minimize the impact? That's what it's all about. So we do these things according to what FEMA is dictating so that it's eligible for FEMA grants. That's the hazard mitigation plan. As part of this update, the town also underwent the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Planning Process, MVP. That's a state program that the town, it also looks at natural hazards and impacts to people and property, but it looks at it through the lens of climate change. We know what happens now through our hazard mitigation plan. We say to ourselves, what do we think, how will those weather patterns be altered due to climate change? So that's what we wanted to look at. So there's two different things going on. It's still the big picture. It's still trying to reduce the risk and threats to human health and property, but it also says, what's climate saying that's going to happen to us? The fun thing about the MVP program, it's a little more flexible. It's a state program, and actually the town of Adams has already received its first grant out of that project. It was the first round of grants in a brand new program in the state, and Adams was one of the first towns to get money out of that first grant. So when we look at climate changes and weather patterns, we start to look at the data and says, what have we observed? Not so much into the future yet, but what have we observed happening with our weather patterns? In the Northeast, we see that we have gotten a little bit more rain annually, but how it's being delivered is what's causing the problem. Instead of rain somewhat evenly through our 4 seasons and through our, more temperately, we're now getting our storms in big bursts. We're getting storms that our rain is being delivered in big bursts, and then we have dry periods in between. It's not quite the way it used to be. So that's what's happened, and we're seeing these big bursts are what is really overwhelming our storm drain systems. Our natural streams are jumping their banks more often. We're seeing more stream erosion. We're seeing more flooding. So that's one thing. That's gone up substantially, 71% in the Northeast, just from 1958. So in our lifetime, that's happened. Something we also want to think about is temperature. Temperature has also increased rather substantially. And the temperature changes alters several things. But it alters not only how we get our water, it also dictates how our water is going to be available to us. Hotter temperatures mean more evaporation. There's a whole host of things that come with temperature changes and hydrology. What also comes with that change is human health. We have vulnerable populations like seniors, folks without air conditioning, folks who have chronic ailments. The temperature changes are going to alter and affect their health as we go on. So we have to think to ourselves, as the temperature rises, how do we as a community adapt to that and help our community and help our residents survive those changes? Those extreme precipitation events I talked about, those big bursts that we got, there's been a couple of things. One is, since the 70s and 80s, we do have more water than we had. We have more precipitation coming down. There's been a stepped increase in our stream flow, in erosion, and flooding. We also have seen a huge increase in the events where you have more than 2 inches of rain in a day. That doesn't sound like much, but when it's coming down in a 24-hour period or less, in a couple of hours, now all of a sudden we have streams that jump their banks. We have flooding in our roadways because our storm drain systems aren't ready. We have culverts and bridges that are overwhelmed. So we've seen quite a bit of increase. And as you see on the screen, since the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we've got that jump since the 2000s, really, where we're getting more of our rain in those bursts. That is what DPWs and other municipal departments have to think about. How do I handle those big bursts? The photograph you see here is that burst. We just had it in Adams in September on South Wickbrook, the Lime Street, Davis Street, and Charles Street. A lot of damage was done there, and that's that photograph from that. That's the kind of bursts that we can expect to see more of in the coming years. How do we plan for that? How do we make sure that we're not constantly blowing out on a cycle of having our roadways, our culverts, our infrastructure damaged, and then going and repairing them, and then having to repair them again and again? So we have to think to ourselves, how do we build things better and differently? And that's what part of this whole planning process is. Where is it occurring, and how can we make it better? The thing about temperature is that right now in the Berkshires, we have been pretty buffered. We are a little higher in elevation. We don't have those urban cores. We don't have those heat islands that you hear about, Manhattan or Springfield or big cities. We're still fairly rural, and we are a little higher in elevation. So we don't have to worry too much in the next 5 years about that. But we need to think about it in the next 20 years or 30 years. Because we're buffered, we have segments of our population that low income or seniors, they don't have air conditioning. So if we have a heat wave, they're the ones who suffer because they don't have the air conditioning to help them cool down. So we say to ourselves, what do we do? If someone's home isn't cooling down, can we provide a cooling center during the day? Because seniors and those with chronic ailments, respiratory, cardio ailments, the hot, humid air, they suffer much more. And there'll be higher incidence of emergency visits. So what we need to do is say, can we provide shelter for our folks who don't have the air conditioning? The thing we need to worry about more, and what we're seeing more on this graph, is that it's one thing when the days are hot. And right now, in the Berkshires, you open your window, you put the fan in the window, and at night, when the temperatures go down, you cool the house down. And your house is cooled down for that next hot day. We're seeing now, we have a very sharp increase in the temperature at night. So now our homes, we can't put the fan in the window and cool the house down because we have temperatures at night that are 70 and over. And that's not going to cool your house down enough to get ready for the next heat wave the next day. So again, we have to say to ourselves, how do we plan as a community to keep people healthy and safe during these heat waves that are going to come more often and be more prolonged. So again, what can we as a community do? Winter changes, that's where the temperatures, besides our evenings, it's the winter changes that are really showing up in the Northeast. We have warmer temperatures. Like tonight, we have less snowpack. Less snowpack has a lot of repercussions. The ground can be still frozen, so if we have more rain on snow or rain on frozen ground events, we have more runoff. That water is not percolating into the groundwater for recharge in spring. That goes right into our streams and into our reservoirs or downstream out into the Hudson and out into the ocean. So it changes our water regimes, it changes our soil moisture, it changes a lot of things. This picture here shows where we've had a rain event. We had a very cold snap, we did have snow, and all of a sudden now we have that cycle. We have snow, then we have rain. And the rain melts the snow, we have accelerated runoff. That makes our roads more damaging. We have freeze thaws more often. It makes the roads more dangerous for driving. So as a community, it's more dangerous for us. So this is Southwick Brook again, during a time when there was a quick thaw in January of 18, and that was all across the county. We had very severe cold, we had frozen rivers and lakes, and then we had that warming trend. So we had flooding is one thing. The other thing we had was broken up ice. So if we have a river or a reservoir or a stream that was frozen, and now all of a sudden we have that warming trend, we have those cycles of cold, warm, we now have ice jams. Ice jams look bad. They can damage roads, but they can also damage bridges. The lower, you see Route 8 on the top picture. Route 8 was closed for a while because there was all that ice came from a small brook, which overflowed, and that ice couldn't get through a bridge covering, so it's just kind of like flooding. The ice can float on the water and then goes out. The lower one is Stockbridge, Route 7 in Stockbridge, on its way down to Great Barrington. That bridge carries the main natural gas line between Stockbridge and Great Barrington. So if that ice was beginning to dam up on that bridge, that could actually damage not only water and sewer, but also cause a natural gas leak. So when we start to see these things, not only is it just inconvenient, like moving ice off a roadway, it actually can be very dangerous. So we have these freeze and thaws that we can expect to happen more often. The other thing is that without the snow insulation, we can have, if we have a cold snap, we could have, without that buffer, without that insulation of snow, we could have the frost driven deeper into the ground. A couple of years ago, we saw that we had water and sewer main breaks all over the Berkshires. North Adams was especially hard hit, but Lenox, Great Barrington, several of the South County towns, the frost was driven into the ground, and normally when pipes were insulated, they were also breaking. So all of our infrastructure is being damaged by this altering weather pattern that's happening much quicker than we're able to go in and replace infrastructure, armor it, protect it, or do what we need to do. Mother Nature is changing faster than we're able to. Tropical Storm Irene is well known in Adams. It was sort of the poster child for events in northern Berkshire County. Williamstown lost an entire neighborhood. The spruces had to be, all of the homes had to be taken down. Over 250 people lost their homes permanently, homes they'd been in for decades. A whole neighborhood was lost. Also in Adams, these are all pictures from Adams. It was a 100-year storm, and there was flooding again. Southwick Brook took out bridges on Lime and Charles and Davis Street. There were all kinds of happenings. This is, I think, Pine or Burt Street. All these roads, all this damages were done from Irene. Again, not so much a burst, but a huge storm from a hurricane that can just come and stall. So these are the things we have to think about. This is the 100-year storm, and this is sort of the thing that all first responders and infrastructure is sort of gauged on, is that 100-year storm. So if we have infrastructure that's not surviving that 100-year storm, we need to say, how can we armor it better, or how can we make it more resilient? The thing about the 100-year storm is not that it's once every 100 years. That's a statistic. It's just a lottery. And we're hearing from some engineers and some scientists that that 100-year storm, the recurrence rate isn't going to be every 100 years. The statistic is going to be more like every 50 years or every 25 years. So we have to think to ourselves, how do we armor and become more resilient if these things are going to come much more often as predicted? We looked at drought. Berkshire County is pretty water rich. We have not had a drought since the 60s, and most of our water managers and our water districts haven't really had to think about it. We haven't been faced with a drought. We haven't been faced with conserving water, issuing bans very often, a very serious ban. We had a drought. The state had somewhat of a drought in 2016 and 2017. Berkshire County fared pretty well. We got off very lightly. But this reminds us that we are not immune to it. So we have to think to ourselves, the flip side of more water is that we might have years where our water is not percolating in our ground often. We have more runoff, we have less recharge, and so our reservoirs and our groundwater isn't recharged as well as it should be because of the altered patterns. So we might be getting more droughts. Because of the temperatures, reservoirs, not so much the groundwater, but the reservoirs will have more evaporation. So if they're not getting if their storms are coming in big bursts and we're not recharging that ground, some of the reservoirs won't be recharged as well either. So we have to think to ourselves, let's not forget about drought. So where in Adams are the problems? I think almost everyone in Adams can pick a neighborhood that they know is impacted. So we begin to look and map these things. We talk to town officials, we talk to the water district, DPW, we talk to neighborhood groups. We know that this map is hard to see, but we know that we have areas in town in red where we have chronic, severe, damaging flooding. And those are the areas, because flooding is really the most prominent, most common, and most damaging hazard in Adams. That's the one we focus so much on. And that's the one historically that has been the severest damages and continues today. In fact, just this past September. So we start to map these areas and we start to look at them and say, what can we do? So we have all these areas. We have the Southwick Brook neighborhood with Lime, Davis, and Charles Streets. We have Burt and Pine Streets. We have Grant Street neighborhood. We have basements in Hoosac Street and Howland Avenue. There's infrastructure on Jordan Street that is deteriorating and needs to be looked at. We have stream channel erosion and scouring. Those big bursts are causing scouring and erosion in our natural streams, and in many areas we have water lines or sewer lines that are going under those stream banks and under those stream channels, and they're being scoured out and exposed. And being exposed exposes them to damages from boulders coming down or from scouring, and it could damage or break those water and sewer lines. The Legion Dam is an area of concern because, number one, it's old and it's deteriorating, has a lot of silt backed up behind it. If it were to fail, there would be damages downstream, not only from flooded waters, but it could be pieces of the dam and it could be sediment. So there could be a lot of sediment deposition, could also be scouring and damaging. So these are some of the areas we start to look at and say, these are where you need to focus on. So we have these two planning processes. We've had the hazard mitigation, and I've talked mostly about that, and we've had a draft plan that we have drafted for public review, and that's why we're here tonight. We also have the MVP, the preparedness planning process, where we had folks come in for a day-long workshop and talk about where in town are the hazards, where do we think we're vulnerable, where are we ready, and where are we not ready. Again, flooding came up in infrastructure. Not surprising, people in the workshop were from town department heads, they were from the Council on Aging, they were from the Water District, they were from businesses, they were residents who had been here for a long time and can remember historic events. So we had a good mix of people from Adams. So we came up with flooding again. We looked at, again, the channeled streams like the river, like some of the concrete channels from the Army Corps. They're kind of at the end of their design life. They're working, but sometimes they're deteriorating and beginning to fall in. Utilities were at risk. We talked a little bit about the water and sewer and the scouring and freezing pipes. We also heard about emergency preparedness. People in the workshop felt that residents in town might not be prepared enough. Were people prepared? Do they know when to evacuate? Where would they go to? Do they know who to call if they think they have to evacuate? Who would they call if they have someone in their home who isn't able, who's not mobile and can't get out? So there was a lot of concern about the preparedness. Remembering back to Irene, and some people had to be evacuated from homes. What if there were another one? What if it was more widespread? So this theme came up quite a bit. A shelter. Where is the shelter? When do we open it? How do we know to tell people to go there? These are the kind of things you don't exercise often, so it kind of came up as a concern among all the workshop folks. Since I'm here, I'm going to talk about Code Red a little bit, because this is going out to everyone in town. There is an emergency notification system in Adams, and it's called Code Red. And if you're not enrolled in Code, if you're a resident in Adams and you're not enrolled in Code Red, go on the town's website and you can put in your information. You can put in your landline phone number, your cell phone number, everybody's cell phone numbers, your address, and you would get notifications from the town. So this is something the town has that everyone should be encouraged to fill out information for. I believe you can actually fill in what you want notifications for. So this is something that the town already has, and we could promote that a little bit more on things like this. And I'll show you where it is on the website in a little bit. So the group, after all these things, and remembering back to that map, all the red sites, we had to say to ourselves, how do we assess and prioritize all the areas in town that we have to handle? Can't possibly afford it. So the group said, let's prioritize and assess those we need to get engineered and prioritize them by different criteria. Maybe the criteria is personal risk and injury. Maybe it's property. Maybe it's impacts. So we kind of look at it and how do we prioritize that? So that was number one, was take our areas and prioritize them and somehow come up with a plan where we can get the biggest safety bang for the buck. Also, there was a thought of being more proactive during an emergency crisis, and that's things like preparedness. So improved communications with the public was one thing that came up out of that workshop, and Code Red is now on the town's website and everybody can sign up for that. That's already something that the town's already done. Success. The rehabilitation of the Adams Memorial School, a timely, perfect time to say, is this a perfect place for our sheltering? Could it be a long-term, large shelter for everyone in town? And while it's being rehabbed, this is a perfect time to make sure that it's equipped to be run as a shelter. So here's an opportunity, again, success, because here's something that we can do right now. So major recommendations that came out of both the planning processes was to try to get some engineering done at those sites in red. And already the town is starting to implement those. There's engineering and there's hydraulic studies going on at several sites. The Lime, Charles, Davis Street site, Burton Pine Street, Grant Street, Jordan, West Kittler, and Croto. There's already engineering being done with that. So step one, the town's moving forward with that. Implementation will be costly, but at least the engineering's getting done so you know what is needed, what is the cost, what are the benefits. You can start to analyze and lay out funding where you can afford it. Water and sewer lines, protecting those. That's something that we have to think about moving forward. Not done so far, but again, that's an action that would be part of this plan, trying to lay out that action. The Bassett Brook Reservoir Dam, that is a backup reservoir. Two things are going on at that reservoir. One is there's an emergency action plan that is being developed. That's an action plan that says if the dam starts to fail, what are the protocols, what do we do? The action plan will include an inundation map that will show who might be impacted downstream if the dam were to fail. It shows protocols of the dam owners. How do we monitor this? How do we know when the dam starts to fail? What does it look like? Who do we call? And how do we get people out of harm's way? That's being developed. So again, that's a step forward. There's the possible removal of the dam, which has been considered costly. Engineering's been done. I think that's still being considered, but that's years. Even if that were affordable today, that takes years to do for permitting things like that. So again, the safety at the reservoir dam is being considered, and actions are moving forward. Land use tools. Things like stormwater regulations, bylaws. Things like controlling development on steep slopes to try to reduce runoff, to try to reduce potential landslide incidences. These are things the town is already looking into. It's already applied for a grant to do some bylaw work on stormwater, so already actions are being done. The shelter plan, once again, sheltering was brought up often in the hazard mitigation and the preparedness planning. So that needs to be done. What's our shelter planning? But again, let's do that while the Adams Memorial School is being redeveloped, because that's a perfect opportunity. Designating more cooling and warming centers, and maybe protocols on how to open those. Most communities in Berkshire County are still sort of a little uneasy about and unsure on when to open them and how to get the word out that it's open. Many towns right now are using senior centers or libraries, councils on aging areas that are already open during the day and have air conditioning. So this is the kind of thing we need to be thinking about, and again, let's put some protocols in place so we know when we should open it, when are people beginning to suffer, and then what are the protocols to open it and let people know it's open. Again, Code Red, that's up and going, and I encourage everyone in Adams to go on the website and sign up. If you don't have the internet, I'm guessing you could probably call the police department and they could help you. So everyone should have their phones in Code Red. It doesn't cost anything, and they will let you know when there's an emergency situation. We talked a little bit about successes. Prioritizing those sites around town that really suffer from chronic damaging flooding. Town of Adams, again, they were able to get that MVP action grant. So that grant is actually going to be looking at all the areas and evaluating where to go to first. So already the town has stepped forward and gotten a grant to start to do that. So that's happening now, and it's a good step forward, and the results of that will help to guide what projects get constructed first, depending on, of course, funding and severity. So I've just babbled on now for half an hour. We're here to get your ideas that you might have We have a draft hazard mitigation plan that's been posted on the website. We would love for you to look through the plan and make, number one, does it look like we covered everything we were supposed to? Are we missing anything? Are there gaps that we should be covering but we're not? I admit it's long and it's dry. If you only have a few minutes to look at it, go to the chapters that you're interested in or that you have some responsibility for as a board member, committee member. Look at those. And then look at the action table. Action table's at the end. That's really the meat of the whole thing. Section 4 of the plan takes all of the analyses that we've done and said, here's our strategy on how to become a more resilient community. So Section 4 is where you want to go if you have a limited time and if, honestly, it's a little long, you find it dull. That's okay. We won't feel bad about that. The plan is posted on the website, and it's on the home page. And to find it, you go to the home page, and here, there's a little arrow on the events piece. Click on that, and you'll find the plan. The plan is in 2 PDFs. One is the main body of the plan, and the other one has a map, that critical hazard map that you saw, and some models, some FEMA models that were run. Those are the appendices. But if you only have time, Section 4 of the main plan. There's going to be hard copies here at Town Hall and at the library. If you don't have the internet, you're welcome to go and view the plans there. We are taking comments beginning tomorrow, or this evening if you want to start this evening. I believe it's posted. We're taking comments tomorrow through February 12th. After February 12th, we're going to finalize the plan, and then it goes off to FEMA for approval, because that's the approval you want, because once FEMA approves that plan, you're eligible for FEMA funding. And right now, I know the town of Adams has its eye on some FEMA funding. So we want to make sure we've got the plan approved by FEMA so that you can go for those grant funds. So that's our plan. It's in draft form. It's out for public review. You can send comments to me. I'm the consultant working on this. It's Lauren, Lauren, at berkshireplanning.org. I think that's posted on the website. Since I've got the home page, you can see on the web page again, right here, down on the home page is Code Red. Click on that and you can sign up for Code Red, and encourage everyone you know to sign up for that as well. And I think I've covered most of it. If there's any questions from the audience, I would welcome them, or any comments. Other than that, I wait to hear from folks out in Adams and send me comments on the draft plan. Is there anyone?
Of course.
Of course, absolutely. I want to hear it.
Two little simple things. I always like the Code Red thing.
Yeah.
It's great. You say call 911, maybe they can set you up if you don't have the internet. But if you don't know that Code Red is there, and I always like to think of things like our tax bills, as they go out to almost everybody, have a little insert in there.
Absolutely.
So I think Donna is there.
Okay.
It would be nice to have a little, like, Code Red, sign up on the website, call, blah, blah, you know.
Yep, perfect.
And the second thing, you mentioned about the gas pipes. I thought they were supposed to have emergency shutoffs if there's a break in the pipe, but I think our pipes might be old and they're not like the new, I know when they're installing in South Dakota and stuff like that, they have automatic cutoffs. Do we have?
I'm not an expert on the natural gas system, but I'm sure they do have shutoffs. But I know in Stockbridge, they were monitoring it very heavily, and the gas company was there as well, just making sure it was okay. But it's just something we need to think about. It's something we hadn't thought about before.
I mean, all of a sudden, if there's a flow, there should be flow detectors in there that
Right.
closes down, upstream, down,
Right.
whatever.
Right. And I'm guessing there is, and I know in Stockbridge, they were in contact with the gas company. Yep. But it's something we don't think about. We just, we attach pipelines, water, sewer, gas pipelines, telephone communication pipelines to the bridge. Simple. And we don't think about things like accelerated ice jams or accelerated flooding with maybe debris like logs or boulders in it. We don't think of that, and we just have to think of that a little bit more because that's going to be what our weather patterns bring for us. We just have to be prepared and monitor those more and be prepared to work with a gas company or the water company if all of a sudden floodwaters are up against that pipe. Joe?
Yeah, one thing that I was at when we got together, and one thing that I don't remember being brought out, and I didn't bring it out, is I think we have a lot of trouble in this community with our retaining walls. For some of our roads, they're getting very old, and a lot of our roads have retaining walls that you can't even see where the river goes. And I think that's something that needs to be taken a look at.
We did look at that in the plan, and there was a couple of different roads that were called out that there were concerns of, landslides or erosion or subsidence. So there were a few sites that were brought out in the plan. I didn't mention them this evening. They weren't sort of such a top priority. But again, that landsliding can happen from saturated soils and movement of earth and boulders. Absolutely. Well, thank you all for being so patient and listening, and we welcome comments from the public. Thank you for coming.